right. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a little older, so needing to refer to notes. Not sure how many of you may know. Again, my name's Teresa. My business is PlebLab Consulting. I work with several different clients, primarily startups, small to medium-sized businesses, and law firms. And I actually have been to law school, but my forte is doing marketing, business strategy, that kind of thing. So when I've done legal marketing, I've tried to encourage lawyers to think more entrepreneurially, not just work in their profession, but consider from day one that they should have an entrepreneurial mindset. When they do, they have a better chance of being successful. But we're going to kind of flip the script on that and have a professional attorney here who works specifically with startups, emerging companies, advising them on things that they need to know for formation, working with VCs, things that you need to have in place in order to be more attractive to potential funders and investors, how not to get in trouble, or at least try to not get in trouble. So we're going to tackle all that. So first, I want to introduce Alan Bickerstaff. Please give him a round of applause. Oh, and in case you can't tell by his shirt, he's also a Bitcoiner. So that's a bonus.
Thank you.
Alan, would you give us a little bit of your background and how you came to be in Texas and do the type of work that you do?
Will do. So, hello, everybody. My name is Alan Bickerstaff. I'm a partner at DLA Piper. I've been in Austin since 1999, representing venture capital-backed companies and startups. Literally from formation through exit. So I've been doing this, whatever that is, 25 years now. I've represented hundreds of startups through hundreds of venture capital financings, M&A transactions, and IPOs, and then kind of everything in between. My day-to-day practice could involve going to a board meeting, advising the board on things, advising founders on employment matters and equity compensation matters, and just about everything you can imagine that would come up in the day-to-day life of a startup. I first heard about Bitcoin. It kind of was when it started getting popular, and it was in the headlines in 2013. And we used to have these South by Southwest parties, and I met some guy, and he looked like he was 12 years old, but he graduated from college, and I asked him what he did, and he said, well, I don't do anything. I'm retired. I started mining Bitcoin when I was a freshman in college. And I went home that night and downloaded the Satoshi white paper and read it and did nothing. So I didn't pick up again until 2017, because I mean, as a person who's like not steeped in cryptography and the issues with the monetary system at the time, it just you read it, it's interesting, but it didn't really click, right? And so I started getting really involved in 2017 and buying Bitcoin, and at first it was all about speculation and doing all that stuff. And as I started learning more, read Parker Lewis's stuff, and really digging in and listening to podcasts, I really kind of became a big fan of Bitcoin. So I was really thrilled to see that we have such a vibrant Bitcoin community here. I didn't actually know that we did until very recently, and that's when I reached out to Teresa and PlebLabs and Kaylee about Bitcoin Commons and all that. So I'm hoping to be much more involved in the community. Hopefully.
So you are the head of the EGVC group at your firm. What does that stand for, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so DLA Piper is a global law firm. It has a long history representing entrepreneurs and technology startups. It's actually one of the predecessor firms was founded in 1969 in Silicon Valley, and it was one of the first Silicon Valley-based law firms to open an office in Austin. So we do we're top 5 venture capital firms. So we do a lot of transactions, have our pulse on the market, know what VCs are looking for, and know how to do deals. We're also number 1 in the world in terms of number of M&A transactions, 14 years in a row. I'm the head of the EGVC group. That stands for Emerging Growth Venture Capital. I'm the head of the group in Texas, not the entire group, but in Texas. So I'm really out, getting out in the community, trying to meet entrepreneurs and investors who are in the space. And I have a personal passion for Bitcoin. So like I said, when I found out about the community that we have here, it became much more interesting to me to get involved and start to meet Bitcoin entrepreneurs. And hopefully I can merge my personal passion with Bitcoin with my professional life as an attorney representing entrepreneurs.
All right, now I'm going to get into the questions that you guys care a little bit more about as people who are working in startups and trying to build companies and what the things you need to learn. But first, a legal disclaimer. Things that you may hear me say, but definitely what you may hear Alan say, does not constitute legal advice for you. You must consult with your own attorney, which in some cases, maybe in the future, might be Alan. So just please keep that in mind. This is what we're trying to provide today is an overarching general view of things that a startup, an entrepreneur should keep in mind or should consider very seriously doing. So let's start that off. We have an idea. How do we form a business?
Great question. So I'm focused on representing companies that are seeking institutional financing. So I'm going to kind of narrow the answer to the question to, if you're thinking about raising institutional capital, these are two questions to ask, right? Are you going to raise institutional capital, number one? Number two, do you want to be able to grant equity to employees in a manner that's very easy and simple? If the answer to those two questions is yes, then the well-worn path is to form what's called a C corporation in Delaware. The reason is it's got a well-worn path. It's very well known. It's simple. The structure is well known. Delaware has a very well-known body of law. Despite what Elon Musk says, Delaware is still the preferred state of incorporation. That could change over time, but it's still far and away where everybody does business. Because I'm going to try to analogize to a code. We've got a lot of developers in here, right? And try to analogize this whole legal thing and the setup of a company to like code, right? And so if you think about it, everybody knows the code in Delaware and it makes it efficient. So everybody, attorneys all over the country, investors, whatever, right? They know Delaware, they know how a C Corp works. And so, they understand that code. And so it makes it a lot easier for everybody to kind of do the same thing. And it operates under the KISS principle, which is keep it simple, stupid, right? VCs aren't typically interested in trying to optimize for taxes. Like if you ever did a deal with a private equity group, you see all these crazy structures with like 7 entities and multiple flow-through entities and all this stuff that's designed to optimize for taxes. And you don't really do that in the startup world because at the end of the day, you're gonna be losing money for a long time, right? It's all about execution. Execution is a much bigger risk than having to worry about tax efficiency. So people don't really get into that. They really focused on just doing the thing that works, right? So that people can get out there building their product and executing on the business plan. So what do you do if you want to do a startup and you want to form a company? My advice is that you find an attorney who's experienced in this space and can help you and advise you, because I'll go through a couple of disasters. We go through these things where we find companies who they form their own company or they use their brother's divorce lawyer to form their corporation, and the code of the corporation, all the documents is like a mess. So if you go to the right person and you get your formation done, then the code, the basis of your entity and how it's structured and the things you can do and how you issue equity and all that stuff is very easy to do. And if you go to somebody who does it all the time, you can slide you into a set of documents. It's very easy. That's like a pre-set up set of code that gets you set up so you can go out and start building your business, protect your intellectual property, maintain your capitalization table properly, and maintain your records properly so that when you go out and raise capital, you're going to check all the boxes for an institutional investor about what you've done in terms of your formation. I hope that's helpful.
Sounds good. One quick word about, I know you've mentioned a lot about C Corps with that. We'll just keep this quick because it's kind of a tail end on that question. But What about an LLC? What about a partnership?
Yeah, so
This is a trick question, actually.
LLCs are good for a lot of things. They don't kind of fit within the KISS principle. It's not easy to grant equity to employees with LLCs, and kind of the whole mantra of the startups is a wide distribution of equity so that everybody participates in the success of the business. So LLCs are great. We use them all the time, particularly in private equity structures, but they're not necessarily very good for startups because they create some complications. It's actually more expensive to use an LLC than it is to do a C Corp for a startup. Partnerships, even worse, right? If it's a general partnership, you don't have the limited liability shield that you would have with an LLC or a C Corp. And if it's a limited partnership, then the structure is even more complicated than an LLC. And so a limited partnership really is kind of reserved for fund structures when you're setting up funds, investment funds. Other than that, these days, they don't have a lot of use cases outside of that world. One other thing I want to mention that everybody should know, maybe you're going to ask this question. There's a new law that just came into effect.
Yeah.
Called the Corporate Transparency Act. It was, I agree. We need to strike it down. The good news is a Georgia court recently just ruled in favor of a plaintiff who's trying to fight this thing, and they claimed it was unconstitutional, but that only applies to that case, so it's still being enforced, and until that goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court and gets overruled, hopefully, we're kind of stuck with the regime right now. So
the key point about that is, and I would encourage you, if you're forming your company or if you already have one, or let's say you have a business and you're thinking about adding something new and you're determining, is it going to be a brand new company or is it going to be a DBA or how do I decide? Part of the issue with this law is what the requirements are for you to report. So for example, a business in Texas needs to file its taxes, just like you as an individual need to file your taxes. But the businesses also must comply with the Secretary of the State, Comptroller, right?
That's right.
For filing franchise tax. And a simple, now I'm talking more like small companies that might not know this. A larger company is probably going to have a comptroller, somebody that knows you have to do this every year in addition to the standard taxes. But if you fail to file your franchise tax, those fines can add up. Even if you're a small company and you didn't meet the maximum threshold where you owe any money, you still have to go through the steps of your franchise filing and say, no, we don't owe any money. If you fail to do that, you may have some fines. So with this new law that's come out, there are some compliance requirements right now. I heard Carol Roth, I think some of you will know who that is, speak about it yesterday on the radio. And two things that she mentioned. If you have an LLC, in her case, she was like, if I had an LLC, I would wait until, and these are her words, I would wait until the end of the year to file because, as you mentioned, the law may change. So having to report and say, I'm not money laundering, I'm not being a nefarious actor here. The other thing I found interesting that she said, if you are thinking about spinning up an LLC, and let's say, we're sitting here in March and April 1st, we go to the state and file our LLC, you have 30 days, although Alan told me right now the window seems to be 90 days.
For the first year. That's right.
In the first year to hit that compliance mark. And I'm telling you, there's plenty of people out there across the nation that have no clue that they are going to be tasked with doing this. So just speak with somebody. Alan can help you with that subsequent, but that's something new that you should be aware of, that it's the government in DC exerting too much control. So let's move on. You mentioned equity. How does a startup, a new company, think about handling equity?
That's a great question. So, and it's an important one. So you got to think about issuing equity as like the code that explains the ownership of the business. And it's probably the most important diligence item that will come up if you're seeking money from investors. So when we set up a new corporation, we have a fixed fee organization package that does all the stuff we're going to talk about today. But for the founders, we would set up what's called a restricted stock purchase agreement. Pretty straightforward. It's got an IP assignment clause in it. Founders typically pay about 1/1000th of a penny per share for their stock, so it's basically free because it's a new corporate vessel that essentially has no value, and it's going to have things like a right of first refusal, an IPO lockup, and an escrow of shares in it. And then we typically set up, we always recommend, particularly when you have multiple founders, that you put vesting on your shares. The vesting is important because imagine you've got 3 founders who divide up the company evenly. They're going to have a third, right? If in 6 months, 9 months, somebody doesn't work out or they just decide this isn't for them, they're going to hang out on the beach, you don't really have a mechanism to get those shares back unless you impose vesting. And so you're kind of stuck with a third of your cap table in the hands of somebody who's not contributing value. So the idea behind vesting is to make sure everybody's incented to stick around, continue to contribute to the success of the business. And then you got to think about securities laws as well. Anytime you issue equity or a security of any type, you should definitely talk with an experienced securities attorney so you can make sure you comply with securities laws. You always have to find a private placement exemption under federal law and under state law. And usually that's pretty simple. It's really simple in a formation, but it can get complicated when you have stock options because you're going to have filing requirements. A lot of states actually have like a pro forma form you got to file, but you got to pay them $400, right? If you issue a security to California is probably the most expensive one, for example, not surprisingly. New York also. So you got to do those things to comply, because if you don't do them, it becomes a diligence item. It can create fines. In California, if you're late doing a filing, they'll charge you $2,500. So it can get really expensive. One other thing I would add about this that's important to understand about getting founder stock and owning stock generally is it's simple. Stock is a little bit easier to understand than stock options, right? Most employees get stock options, founders get stock. I'll explain why in a minute. But the good thing about stock is you hold it for 12 months, you get long-term capital gains treatment. Even better, if you hold it for 5 years for a brand new company with no assets, it's going to qualify for what's called qualified small business stock. Have you guys heard of that? You ever heard of? So qualified small business stock, basically, there's some technical rules we don't need to get into, but basically, if you buy QSB and you own it for at least 5 years, then when you sell that stock, you're going to get tax-free capital gains for up to the greater of $10 million or 10 times your basis in the stock. Founders typically, like I said, get their stock essentially free, so you're capped out at 10 million. Now, there are some ways to do some estate planning type things where you can amplify that $10 million to multiply it across multiple people if you're buying through a flow-through entity. That can get quite complicated, but if you do it, you also typically have to divest ownership, like to your kids or whatever. So not everybody's in that position, but people who are, maybe it makes sense. So it's really a powerful tool to be aware of and understand. So for example, investors, this is always a representation there that make sure you've done the certain things you need to do to be a qualified small business. Because if somebody invests $10 million in your company, they're going to get up to $100 million in tax-free capital gains if you have a really successful exit.
Right, let's look at the next topic. From branding to products to the way you conduct a particular way of running your business, how do you protect that intellectual property? What are some initial steps that a startup or entrepreneur should consider?
Yeah, great question. So again, there's a well-worn path to doing this that everybody will look for in a transaction, and you should do from the day you form your company and start. So the most basic thing you need to do is have what's called a proprietary information agreement with every one of your employees, including the founders. So this is an agreement that says everything you do for the corporation is owned by the corporation. So everybody assigns their IP from their efforts as an individual, as an employee, to the corporation. The corporation owns it. It's particularly important to have something in writing if you hire third-party contractors, whether it's an individual or a company developing code for you, because the common law practice is if you don't have a written agreement assigning ownership to your corporation, then the third party owns it. And so we spend a lot of time when I'm doing venture capital financings with people who didn't do this or didn't do the right things, running around trying to find these third parties, former employees, everybody trying to tie all this stuff up so that the investors can be 100% certain that you've done everything you can do to own the IP that the corporation is creating. And that's the secret sauce typically, right? So it's very important to do that. So a proprietary information agreement, a contractor agreement for contractors to make sure that you actually own the IP. And then of course from there, anytime you're dealing with third parties, you want to execute an NDA that protects your intellectual property, or it restricts their use of the intellectual property, right? And if to the extent it's a trade secret, by having them execute an NDA, it maintains the trade secret status. Of course, there's registered intellectual property, right? If you have a brand name, you have trademarks, things like that, and you want to go get protection for that at the federal level, you should hire an experienced trademarks attorney who will go and do that for you and walk you through that process. You should before you spend a bunch of money branding, it's very advisable to go do a trademark search. Make sure that you looked at your name, made sure you're not going to infringe on somebody else in your space, and you don't spend a bunch of money and then get a cease and desist letter from somebody because you're stepping on their toes, and have to unwind all that and start over with a new branding exercise. I've seen companies have to do it, and it can be painful. And then finally, there's patents, right? If you have patentable technology, get with an experienced patent attorney. Make sure you don't disclose your invention to anybody, not under an NDA, until you've gotten with a patent attorney, you've gotten that patent application filed so you can protect yourself. Because disclosing the invention, the patentable invention, can blow your ability to actually get the patent in the first place. So that's pretty important. And so that kind of in a nutshell is kind of the bucket of stuff that you got to do. And that's kind of the code that underlies how you provide proof of work, so to speak, in terms of how you own your IP. And everybody, when you hire an investors counsel, they will come through, they will look at all this stuff, and they will make sure that you've done this, literally down to the employee, right? You've got to disclose every employee who didn't sign a proprietary information agreement, for example. And I've got plenty of horror stories. I just represented an investor who invested in a company, and they checked every one of these boxes. They literally did absolutely nothing correct. And it tripled the time it took to get the deal done. It probably tripled the cost, frankly, and just made it much more complicated for everybody to get it done. So I think that's it on the IP.
So you have an idea, you're excited, you get some people to collaborate with you, you form your company, you're going and blowing, you're working on the project that you're so passionate about, and you might be neglecting or not doing properly corporate records. So tell us what's important there.
So this all ties into everything else that we just kind of talked about, right? So how do you prove up all this stuff, right? You've got to have a system of maintaining your corporate records, your capitalization table, stock issuances, restricted stock purchase agreements to everybody who's purchased stock options for everybody who's got a stock option, your IP, a copy of the PIA that every employee signed. If you set up a company, that day one thing you got to do, that you got to put in your HR to-do list, is have them sign that proprietary information agreement, because you will be asked to provide it when you're raising money. And so all that stuff just makes it very important that you really have some sort of system to track your documents in an organized fashion, so you can easily and simply produce them, stick them in a data room that investors and their counsel can review, and check the box in terms of ownership, who actually owns the company. Typically what will happen is an investors counsel will go through every single stock issuance, line by line by line, tying it out to the board consent. Did you get board approval? Did you actually issue the stock certificate? Did they actually sign a stock purchase agreement that has a right of first refusal and other transfer restrictions in it? All this stuff gets checked in detail every time you do a financing. So another very important, piece of code, if you will, is just like making sure you got records that can prove up all the stuff that we just talked about. I think that's it. So the PIAs particularly important and the contractor agreements, because you'll have to provide all those in a diligence exercise. And then, of course, the license agreements. You've got to the extent you have third-party licenses, like real license agreements, not like Microsoft Office, but of course you have to have a license. But, when you're negotiating third-party license agreements with customers, with vendors and the like, you got to make sure you've got that all proved up, particularly with customers, because that's going to be a key diligence item, again, in terms of IP ownership, because we've seen instances where people, they sign whatever's put in front of them. They think it's a form, and they literally assigned ownership of their IP to the third party. And it's killed companies, it's killed financing. So it's really important to get somebody who who understands the licensing and technology transactions to advise you and make sure that, you're not tripping this up and doing things that can come back to haunt you later. So there's a lot of things, a lot of little nuances that, you may not be aware of that could get picked up. So always recommend that you get somebody who's in that space to advise you to negotiate those agreements.
I've got one more question for you, but I did want to add something first before we wrap. I want to try and go quickly through this because we want to get back and make sure we're on time for the presentations this afternoon. But we mentioned that, or I mentioned that DLA is a global law firm. That means they're going to have a variety of practice areas. When you're starting out, you may want to find an attorney that is a little more generally focused, or is a business or corporate attorney, or in this case, somebody who's very familiar with entrepreneurs and emerging companies, has the experience working with VCs. But then there will come a time when you'll need a second layer, and that could be your attorney or your network who is well networked, or a firm like DLA who has the ability to say, Alan can say, I've got a guy down the hall, or I've got a guy in Dallas or Nashville or wherever who can talk to you about your employment law issues, or your mergers and acquisitions, maybe team up with what Alan would be doing, and so on. So they will have, maybe you want to bring somebody in from overseas and you need an immigration attorney. So there will be other layers of proficiency that you might need in the legal space to help you address what you need. But just to get started, because that is what we are here talking about today, what would a young entrepreneur, young company need to consider as the best time to hire an attorney?
Yeah. I always recommend that you get somebody involved really early in the process. When you think you're at the level where you're ready to start developing code, creating a product, whatever, it's important to form a corporation, I think, and get it done right. And if you get it done right, it's going to save you a ton of time and money down the road, because it's much easier to do it right the first time than trying to clean it up. With us, we try to make it super simple for entrepreneurs. We have a fixed fee package that gives you all the tools I just talked about. So, set you up with a Delaware C Corp. You got founder vesting, got forms of NDA, proprietary information agreement, contractor agreements, and employment offer letters. So all the things you can kind of get up and running, and you can protect yourself with these tools if you use them properly. You don't have to call your attorney every day running up your bill, right? So it makes things very efficient for you. And to your point, the formation's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. We've got the documents, we do it right. Once you start developing coding, you're going to need other expertise. We've got a technology transactions group, right, who can help you negotiate the license agreement. Inevitably, you're going to have some sort of employment issue where you have to terminate somebody, or somebody's complaining, and so you need an employment attorney to kind of help walk you through that. And then there's the tax attorneys and / executive compensation attorneys. There's always complicated nuances that you have to deal with when you're issuing equity or negotiating an employment agreement with an executive you're bringing on board, those kinds of things. So we try to be a one-stop shop where we can do all those things for you. And once you grow, we have, much more sophisticated services that you may need in the future, right? So for example, we have a lobbying arm. We have, if you're doing a startup that requires FDA approval, we have FDA people. If you're in the telecom space, we have FCC people. Most startups don't need that stuff unless you're in a specialized regulatory area early on, but we have them when you need them. And our groups are, have people in them dedicated to working with startups. And that's the kind of thing that you want. You want to find somebody who's focused on startups, knows how to work with startups, because you're cash constrained. You typically need somebody who's efficient, who's done this over and over and over again, because you see the same problems come up over and over again. So you can call up one of us typically and have a 10-minute conversation. We'll have an answer for you, right? So very quick, very efficient, very cheap, versus calling up somebody who, is a divorce lawyer and then going to have to go, try to figure it out. I don't do things outside my practice area because I just know how it is. There's all kinds of little traps and nuances, and if you're not aware of them, then you could do something wrong and really create bigger headaches down the road. So I think that answers your question, but But that's
I think that
what
was
we
great.
do.
To follow up with Alan, I know that several of you may have additional questions, or you may want to just hear some more stories of things that clients did wrong and that you should avoid. Of course, he would name the clients, hypothetically clients. But you can follow up with Alan today. That's Alan Bickerstaff. You can also find his bio on the DLA website, dlapiper.com. If you have other questions a few days down the road, you can reach out to me, Teresa at PlebLab.com, or you can ask Car, and we can put you in touch with Alan. And I can give you some very general guidance and then point you in the right direction of what you may want to prepare so that you can ask Alan and be efficient there. So thank you for your attention, and we will go on with the rest of our show.
Thanks. Thank you.